Good day, denizens. Welcome to yet another installation here of our discussion throughout history, and a special shout out to the textbook Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, helping out with this one as with many others. What we talk about here, the Great War, and of course interspersed within that, the Russian Revolution. A lot of complex stuff, a lot of things going on in the early 20th century as all the imperialism and nationalism and technology and competition and social Darwinism and lunacy of the 19th century all collides and explodes in what they called at the time the Great War. And you can see some of the images around some of the leaders in this event. Georges Clemenceau up there in the top left, leader of France, who had a major bitter hatred of Germany. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. President. The United States doesn't get into this war until April of 1917, at least in terms of soldiers, though they are helping the Allied forces. Toward the very end of the war, we'll finally see for the first time aircraft carriers. On the top right, you see Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Vladimir Lenin, who is going to lead the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist revolution in Russia, and overthrow the Tsar and create the Soviet Union. We'll see for the first time in war the use of airplanes. Not necessarily the first use of aircraft. There were dirigibles used prior to this, blimps essentially, and balloons, things like that. But this will be the first time that we have airplanes flying over. Looking all the way over there to the left, good old Lord Kitchener, the British Navy trying to get you to come and die for war, or I mean fight in the war. And down in the bottom left, the reality that was World War I, the trenches and trench warfare because of the stalemate that the Great War becomes. And then moving from the left to the right on the bottom there, tanks. Tanks will make their debut about midway through the war. The British naming it after their bathtubs, the tank. Moving in a blistering, I don't know, like 1 or 2 miles an hour. But the first tanks will be introduced to the battlefield in an effort to try to break the stalemate and get over no man's land and take the enemy trenches. On the bottom there, you see Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia. He'll end up being the last Tsar of Russia. And his cousin, Wilhelm II, the Kaiser, there in the far right of Germany. Nicky and Willie, they called each other. They actually sent each other correspondence before the war, of course. And they had a common grandmother, Queen Victoria, Britain. So what we're trying to get at here, what are the root causes of this conflict? The root causes of the Great War are much deeper than the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. That's not really a cause, that's just the spark that gets it going. So what are those deep-seated causes that get things to the point where just an assassination in Sarajevo creates the worst world war in human history to that point? How was this war both global and a total war? Talk about that. But also kind of talk about this as a European civil war. I just pointed out there how Kaiser Wilhelm and Nicholas II related. Is this a family affair? And the Russian Revolution that explodes in the midst of all of this, making this a very complex time, complex era. We'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk about what David Lloyd George said upon negotiating the peace for this conflict. I guess it wasn't much of a negotiation, but the Treaty of Versailles and the so-called peace built upon quicksand. And then some of the major terms that we'll look at here. So we start with a little kind of side story, but a side story that really captures the essence of this conflict. There's Vera Brittain from Britain. And Vera Brittain was she's going to become a rather prolific writer toward the end of this war and after the war. And she ends up serving, as a nurse during the conflict, trying to help, the wounded and so on. And her diary, which she donated to public use upon her death, really gives us some interesting insight into how war was viewed before this conflict erupted. And you see her entry here, Monday, 3 August. Today has been far too exciting to enable me to feel at all like sleep. In fact, it is one of the most thrilling I have ever lived through. Without doubt, there are many more to come. That which has been so long anticipated by some, scoffed at by others, has come to pass at last. Armageddon in Europe. Why on earth is this lady fired up about Armageddon? Well, the thing is this. At this time, there's still this notion of glory in warfare, that you're going to go off to war, that you're going to gain glory on the battlefield, you're going to become a hero, you're going to have this nice uniform, looking all sharp in the uniform, bright, shiny bayonet fixed on your rifle, and you're going to charge into the battlefield and gain glory. You're going to come back, and women are going to throw themselves at your feet, and men are going to buy you drinks and just worship you. Those are kind of the old notions of war, that there's this idea of glory in war. But Vera Brittain finds out in the hard way, or a hard way, about this war. Her fiance, her brother, and all three of them, plus their best friend, all fight in this conflict. And for Vera Brittain, her brother dies. Their best friend dies in the conflict. And in the midst of the war, in December, I believe of 15, if not 16, she's awaiting for her fiance to come home, named Roland, and she anxiously awaits a phone call to say that he has been discharged to come home. He had been wounded in battle, but the call she receives is that he had died, and that he also perished in this conflict. And the reality of this conflict is that there is no glory in war, and that these men who are going to go off to fight, for millions of them, the last sound that they will ever hear is the sound of a machine gun, and giving away, trying to gain a couple of yards territory at the cost of eternity. And that's going to be the reality of the Great War. Okay, so just an overview of the major causes of this thing. So number one, nationalism. So throughout the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century, we have these major powers, European powers, but later on the United States as well, but mostly countries like Britain and France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, even Spain, even though they're fading, who are all competing around the globe to gain territories, right? And in the midst of these imperialistic endeavors, recall that these countries, their leadership, were undergirded by social Darwinism, this belief that somehow Europeans, especially Anglo-Saxons, but Europeans in general, were a superior race to everyone else, contrasted with everyone else on the planet. And that, everywhere they went, whether it be the continent of Africa that they're pretty much going to conquer, save for two places, Southeast Asia, China, all these places where they're either formally taking over or economically dominating, or both, there's this belief that they are superior, these Europeans. But at the same time, there's this intense spirit of nationalism in these places as well. I mean, essentially, this belief amongst Germans that they are superior, amongst the British that they are superior, amongst the French that they are superior. So this nationalism and this kind of superiority complex, not only is it continent-wide, but it's also, within these countries. So that makes them also very competitive against one another. You add on to that some of these fading powers like the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, which is going to become Austria-Hungary. Whenever you have a hyphen there between your name, that's always a bad sign. But as the Ottoman Empire is fading, as we move into the late 19th century, there had been countries like Britain and France and Russia kind of using the Ottoman Empire as a pawn, taking territory from it, using it to play off against Britain and France, using it to play off against Russia, and so on. And the Ottomans are just, severely weak as we roll into the 20th century. But what that means is that these other major powers, like your Britain and your France, Russia, we'll talk about them a little bit more later, but they're all vying to try to take over those territories. But there's more at play than just that, right? There's this notion of pan-Slavism, pan meaning across or encompassing, covering a wide swath. The largest Slavic country on the planet is Russia, and still was back then. And this idea of pan-Slavism is that Russia has this kind of obligation to protect its people, its own Slavic peoples. And that's going to become a huge, huge issue between Russia and Austria-Hungary just before this conflict begins. We also have another major rivalry going on between the Germans and the British. We talked in a previous presentation about the formation of Germany. And remember, Germany, relative to this conflict, is brand new on the map, right? They come in 1871. They unified by Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm. And by the time we get to about the year 1900, Germany is the second or third strongest economy on earth. That's how powerful Germany becomes. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Willie, who we started with in the first slide, really is one of these guys with a big ego and a lot of testosterone and this belief that Germany should be the preeminent global power. He's getting the Germans to take over places in the Pacific Ocean, Southern Africa. So basically, the Germans trying to throw their weight around. Well, to do this, of course, you need naval forces and military forces. So Germany is building those up. But remember, still the number one country on the planet, economically, frankly, politically, militarily, is the British in the 19th century. So the British see Germany as a threat, as someone who could usurp their power. So basically, we get this kind of arms race between both Britain and Germany. So this kind of buildup of arms and weapons. Then, of course, you have the French. The French were absolutely embarrassed in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Remember, that's the conflict that afterward Germany was finally able to unite. And of course, Germany throws their unification birthday party where? In the Palace of Versailles, right in the heart of France. The French never forgave Germany for this, right? So the French, since 1871 have been carrying this kind of deep-seated, revenge seeking attitude toward Germany. So, if anything kind of breaks out here, there's no doubt that the French aren't going to get along with the Germans. And then on top of that, good old Otto von Bismarck, who we just talked about, he also formed all kinds of alliances. Remember, his biggest fear for Germany, which will come true, was that Germany would get into a war in which it had to fight on two fronts. So basically what Bismarck was able to do is form alliances with countries like Russia. Problem is, Bismarck gets fired by Kaiser Wilhelm II, or, just let go, I guess. And the alliance with Russia is able to expire, which then drives Russia into the arms of France. And remember, the French, of course, helped the Russians build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So basically, the French and the Russians become allies, which means, if you look at a map of Europe, that Germany is indeed surrounded. Germany, of course, then allies with Austria-Hungary. So because of this alliance with Austria-Hungary, once again, look at your map of Europe, they're right in the center, hence the Central Powers. But that's the thing, these military alliances, the beliefs in war, like Vera Brittain showed us and that so many people espoused and believed back then, also said that, there's a gentlemanly way of diplomacy, right? If you have an alliance with another country, you are dedicated to helping that country. If they go to war, you're going to war, and that's all there is to it. So this tangle of alliances are also going to kind of pull everybody into this conflict, where basically then we have the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, I think Bulgaria, some other countries will join the Central Powers, but your two big players being Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then you have the Entente, the friends or friendship between Britain, France, and Russia. Really, it's France and Russia, but Britain's going to get involved in this conflict too. So here you can see, what the main alliances are, or the sides, if you will. See the Central Powers, and then of course the Allies. The Allies are a little bit complicated, right? Britain and France and Belgium. We'll talk about their involvement too. And Russia. Eventually, the United States, though, after it declares war in April of 1917. But things get a little bit complicated. Russia, of course, totally falls apart. It is falls apart at the seams. Revolution. It's just going to be obliterated. But the United States, when this war starts, is completely neutral. Or at least it says it's completely neutral. That was Woodrow Wilson's claim. As a matter of fact, Woodrow Wilson gets reelected in 1916 in the United States with the argument, or rather with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the reality is this: the United States was funding Britain and France. They're given plenty of money, had plenty of investments in these places. On top of that, you have a huge strain of anti-Germanism in the United States. Yes. Sauerkraut was called Liberty Cabbage. Hamburgers were freedom sandwiches or something to that effect. The leader of the Boston Philharmonic was arrested for playing an opera by a German composer. So there's all kinds of just anti-Germanism in the United States before the U.S. is even in the war, right? And on top of that, this is a world war. And you might say, well, wait a second, most of it's just on the Western Front, right? Well, not exactly, but more so keep in mind, too, that these European powers hold colonies around the planet, right? So when the British are fighting in this war, India is going to be helping them. The Irish are going to be helping them. Sometimes in Europe, you're going to have Indian fighters there, right? They'll be fighting in Africa in these colonies between these powers. The Germans will have Unterseebooten, U-boats, submarines all over the Atlantic Ocean. There's no doubt that this is a global war. Is it global to the extent of World War II? No, but it definitely is global. World War II, of course, makes World War I look like a battle. But nonetheless, this is a world war, mostly because of the colonies that these empires hold. So here you see the tangle of alliances of which I spoke previously, and you can see the Central Powers there in orange, and of course the Allies in the green. And you can see that Germany is definitely surrounded when this conflict breaks out, and it's going to break out, I guess, or the spark is going to occur right down there in the Balkans. And indeed, that's it. We've all heard the Archduke Franz Ferdinand as some people would say the cause of the war. And of course, that's just not correct, right? It's his assassination that sparks the thing, because it kind of begins the wheels turning and puts everything in motion to enact all of those alliances that had been around, right? But all of that stuff doesn't happen if there wasn't already this, intense nationalism and bitterness and animosity and technological buildup amongst these powers to begin with. And we'll delve deeper into, the conflict itself, but just to give you, a general overview of what goes on here. Just overall, kind of bird's eye view of this conflict. Germany, of course, is going to advance very quickly into France. They go through Belgium, which pulls the British into the conflict, and essentially get to the Marne River, a few dozen, 30 or 40 miles, I think, outside of Paris. And then at the Marne River, of course, is going to be the stalemate, where basically both sides are able to dig in, and this becomes the Western Front. And just to give you an example, the Battle of the Marne is considered to be the first battle of the Great War. The thing is that there are numerous quote, battles of the Marne, because the battle never really ends because of the stalemate on this Western Front. And, what these sides thought, including people like Vera Brittain, thought that this would be some kind of quick war, some kind of quick conflict. They were very much wrong. And instead, it becomes the deadliest war in human history to that point. And on the Western Front, at least, 3 to 5 million at least are killed just on that Western Front of territory. And on that Western Front, running from the English Channel down to northern Switzerland, neutral, of course, machine guns, barbed wire, trenches, all through. The life in the trench, life in the trenches was just terrible. And we'll talk about that as well. By 1915, the war is in a total stalemate. Of course, we are going to have a Christmas truce where they all play soccer, and then a couple days later go back to killing each other. But nonetheless, some of these battles during this conflict, like the Battle of the Somme, the British in one day lost like 20,000 killed at the Battle of the Somme, as men would just charge into machine gun after machine gun. And, really that's what causes the stalemate of this conflict. It's the machine gun. And there was simply no way to get across no man's land, the area between the trenches, and take the other guy's trench without facing those machine guns. But let's talk about the assassination real quick. So this guy, Francis Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie, they go down to Sarajevo, down in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is in the Balkans. And what had been going on was within the last decade before this, the country of Serbia had become independent down in the Balkans. Now, Serbia, the Serbs are Slavic. So once Serbia became independent, they immediately had an ally in Russia due to Pan-Slavism. But Austria-Hungary, this kind of fading empire, right? Austria-Hungary had been falling apart. You had all these nationalistic movements amongst the Hungarians and the Czechs breaking away. But, they're still in that nationalistic, imperialistic mold where they want to keep plundering and taking over to kind of build up nationalism. So they had their eyes set on the Balkans. So they're moving toward the south. Well, the people in the Balkans, the Serbs, Slavic peoples, they know that, and they don't want Austria-Hungary down there as their oppressor, their imperial power over them. So essentially, they just don't want Austria-Hungary there. Well, this guy Francis Ferdinand and his wife Sophie is pregnant with, I think, their fourth kid, and it's actually their wedding anniversary as well, 28 June of 1914. Well, they decide that they're going to take a little drive parade style through the streets of Sarajevo. As a matter of fact, everybody knew to come out and watch because it was put in the newspapers where they would be traveling. To make a long story short, there's a terrorist organization present at the time called the Black Hand. The Black Hand operates out of Serbia. Not necessarily via the Serbian government, but nonetheless, they have a group of assassins, 7 or 8 guys, who have been instructed to basically kill this guy. He's seen as an oppressor, right? As a matter of fact, he's also visiting on another day that was especially touchy for the Serbs. June 28th was the Battle of Kosovo, Poljan. And during this battle, the Ottomans, ransacked the Serbs, and it's kind of a memorial kind of day for them. This is way back, 13 or 1400s. But nonetheless, so really, the visit by this guy is absolutely insulting, right? On all kinds of fronts. And this young guy, Gavrilo Princip, jumps out and fires a couple of shots. He fires one that hits Sophie in the abdomen, another one that hits Archduke Francis Ferdinand in the neck, and kills them both. Francis Ferdinand begged his wife to stay alive for the children, but they're both going to die. But that's the thing, is that Francis Ferdinand was the heir to the throne in Austria-Hungary. So basically then, because he is the heir to the throne, he is obviously viewed by the Austrian people as someone with obviously a lot of power, a lot of political power, a lot of political pull, a very important individual. But his death then is going to really become an excuse more for Austria-Hungary. Looking at the map here, so you can see where it says assassination. You can see where Francis Ferdinand was assassinated, down there to the south in the Balkans. And this is where Austria-Hungary was trying to, gain this kind of imperialist foothold there. Once this occurs, you look over to the east and you see Russia. And remember that Russia, Pan-Slavism, very much behind Serbia. Well, basically what Austria-Hungary does is they issue an ultimatum to the Serbs. They blame Serbia basically for this assassination, and they issue an ultimatum. They basically tell Serbia, turn over elements of the Black Hand, give us access to all of your files, let us come in and our agents come in and inspect all your files and so on. And if you don't let us do these things, we will declare war on you, right? Austria-Hungary was hell-bent on declaring war regardless, right? And on top of that, while this is going on, you have Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, and basically his people are telling Austria-Hungary, oh no, you leave Serbia alone, right? They're our brothers. Just doesn't, you just leave them alone. We don't know that they did this or whatever, but we can work this out, right? But at the same time, you have Germany and Kaiser Wilhelm. Remember, Nicholas II's cousin. And Kaiser Wilhelm looks at this situation and he tells Russia, hey, you guys go away. This has nothing to do with you. Austria-Hungary is our ally. We uphold our alliance, and we're going to hold Serbia accountable for this as well. So what begins to happen then is things just start to fall apart. As we move into the late summer of 1914, Russia begins to mobilize its forces. France begins to mobilize its forces. Germany mobilizes. Now, back then, when you mobilize, in other words, you're arming troops and you're moving them toward a front. Back then, once you start doing that, there's really no turning back. That was a declaration of war, right? You're telling your neighbor that you are using those, hundreds of thousands of troops to march across the border and take you over. And basically, what you're going to see is what you see here on the Western Front. Within the red circle there is a total stalemate. So here's what goes down. Basically, Germany already had a prearranged plan called the Schlieffen Plan. Alfred von Schlieffen had developed this plan back in early 1900s. And it was made because Germany feared a two-front war, which makes sense that they would. And the Schlieffen Plan basically said that if a conflict starts to break out between Germany against Britain, or rather Germany against France and Russia, then what Germany would do is they would mobilize their forces toward Belgium. Yes, Belgium. Because Belgium is an easier, lower land to be able to march troops through at this time. I guess it still would be today, but you don't need to march troops like you did back then. We have other technologies. Anyway, so basically what Germany does is they mobilize their forces, which is an act of war in itself, and they ask Belgium, hey, Belgium, you mind if we march a few million men through your territory? They're not going to do anything. Everything will be fine. We'll just follow a couple of roads and make our way to France. To which Belgium responds, no, right? You can't allow, millions of soldiers from a foreign country to march through your territory for a whole lot of reasons. Nonetheless, basically this leads then to Germany declaring war on Belgium and invading Belgium, which then pulls in Great Britain, who is allied to protect Belgium. Now, of course, the Germans are moving toward France, which leads the French to declare war on the Germans, which means the French are also at war with Austria-Hungary. But when Germany declares war on France, that means that they're also at war with Russia. And there you have this, quote, world war, because remember, these countries also have their colonies all around the planet. And basically, once the Germans are able to get into France, into the Western Front, the British are finally there, and various other soldiers, and we basically just get this stalemate. Neither side can really move. And basically the whole Western Front for the duration of this war is only going to shift by a few miles here and there, as millions of guys are just massacred over the course of 4 years. I mean, basically where the Western Front is in 1914 is going to be darn close to where it is by 1918, sadly. And there's no decisive victories in the conflict. It's just this stalemate and bloodbath on that Western Front. And, just the terrible military strategies. You have to understand that, many of these generals who are running this conflict, we're talking about guys who were educated in the 19th century, right? They were trained in Napoleonic warfare. Well, what do you do in Napoleonic warfare? Well, you fire off a volley, maybe 2 volleys, then you fix your bayonet and you charge. The most effective weapon is the bayonet, right? The sword on the end of your gun. Things have changed by World War I, though. Problem is you have machine guns. The gun now is indeed mightier than the sword, right? And basically, with this, you have these generals and colonels who just are ordering charge after charge, telling men to, quote, go over the top, which means, probably around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, you're going to go up out of your trench and try to charge across no man's land to take the enemy trench. Problem is, the enemy's got machine gun nests and there are landmines laid down and everything else, and these guys are just massacred. And they keep doing this, go over the top charging for the first couple of years of the conflict, and it's just at astronomical, terrible human costs. Here you see the Schlieffen Plan. So this was Germany's grand plan to try to win this thing. But because they have to invade Belgium, that means that basically Belgium, their ally, their protector is the British. So that guarantees British involvement in the conflict. There you see the Battle of the Marne, the Marne River, just so many miles outside of Paris there. But it's at the Marne where things are halted, and basically that Western Front's going to be set up, that line, and the Battle of the Marne, amongst other battles, would just go on for the next 4 years. So here's the thing: once Germany, declares war on these countries and so on, there's immediate this kind of propaganda backlash, I guess, and Germany is automatically vilified as the enemy. The thing is, in this conflict, it's as clear as mud how many sides are to blame in this thing, or maybe it's crystal clear too, in that when this conflict ends, the whole thing will be blamed on Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they're so weak, what does it matter? And because of that, basically Germany is going to be charged, $30 billion in reparations, and that day's money. Germany can never recover from that. But we know in terms of the causes of this conflict that who is to blame is more complicated than just Germany. But that doesn't matter. It's always about who wins the battle of propaganda, who wins the battle of changing people's perceptions and how they view things. And that's going to be the Allies, especially the United States. When Germany invades into Belgium, you see the Belgium, Remember Belgium poster there. Germany is absolutely vilified by the press in the United States, but also Britain and France. And they depict the Germans as these rapists and murderers, rumors about the Germans, indiscriminately killing infant children and things like this. Yeah, I mean, the Germans obviously were brutal and harsh where they, marched into, where they went to wars. There's no doubt about that. But, that's typically the case in these types of conflicts and these types of wars. That's not justifying it. It's terrible. But point being is that British, the French, Russia, all of these sides are pretty brutal and harsh. But nonetheless, what the Allies are able to do is take hold of this and use it to their advantage. The United States actually creates its own government organization, the Committee on Public Information. This is a government organization led by a guy named George Creel, who was friends with Woodrow Wilson. And their job is to sway American public opinion. It's the first time, not the last, but the first time ever in American history that a government organization is created to try to tell their own people how they should think and perceive this conflict. The Germans get the nickname of the Hun because they are depicted as especially bloody and violent, going all the way back to like Attila the Hun. That's where the name's coming from. So yeah, I mean, the Germans are depicted as, you can see there, the mad brute, right? As these kind of animals, as these violent, evil people who just were hell-bent on war. But the reality is most of these countries were ready to go to war and looking forward to going to war. And unfortunately, this is a new kind of war. This is a war in which the Industrial Revolution, the first one and the second one, is put into full effect. Now, typically a soldier would have carried a rifle like you see over there on the left, Springfield rifle, American gun, in this conflict, carrying it, in the trench. But you would also have very heavy machine guns like the one you see there in the center. Very heavy, as in like 80 or 90 pounds. So, you're not going to run across the battlefield carrying this machine gun, right? Typically it took two men to operate it. One guy's pulling the trigger and one guy's helping to feed the bullets. And you can see the can there to help keep it cool. And this would be stationed in a nest, at either end or both ends of a trench. And it's the sound from that machine gun there that's going to be the last sound that millions of men are going to hear. Now, the machine gun you see there on the right also has a stand, but it was a little bit more portable. I want to say it was like 20 or 30 pounds. Thing is, these things would get intensely hot, so it's not like you're, running around with a machine gun in hand. Nonetheless, this war is going to have casualties that are higher than no other war before. There's just no comparison to what happens with the Great War. And this is due in large part just to the technology that comes out on top of all the nationalistic zeal, the imperialistic drive of these European countries. It all just comes to a crescendo with this conflict. We're talking decades and decades, if not centuries, of hate, bitterness, animosity toward one another. And it finally explodes at one of the worst times ever, when all of these countries have all these terrible killing technologies. And it's more than just the guns. It's poison gas, submarines, aircraft, tanks, flamethrowers will come out in this conflict. So it's a very, very deadly conflict with all the technology and all the causes that led up to it all coming to play on the Western Front. And just some of the other technologies that you see here. There's a cool little video from the History Channel there. It's on YouTube. I'll give that a look-see. It'll show you some of the technology. But just looking here, I mean, you see in the top center, you still see a Zeppelin there. Zeppelins are still used. Were still used, for bombing and things like that. Problem is once you get fighter pilots flying in the aircraft, once they start shooting bullets toward those Zeppelins, well, the Zeppelins were filled with hydrogen back then, which is highly flammable. So it became a very bad idea. You didn't want to be in charge of the Zeppelin team. You see some of the other weapons, some of the grenades there on the bottom right. The one color picture over there on the right in the middle is a chair leg. You see, if you're down in the trenches for long amounts of time, you're writing letters, and you write letters home. And if you don't have enough weapons because supplies have run short for whatever reason, you ask Ma and Pa to send you whatever kind of weapon they can, right? So they would send like knives and daggers and stuff like that. But if you still can't get a hold of them, right? You can't get weapons from anywhere else. What do? Well, you take a chair leg and you wrap some barbed wire around it. And that's a weapon. Somebody gets down into your trench, you can bludgeon them with that. And that's what that would have been used for there on the right. Some of the hand grenades you see there, the potato masher hand grenade was a German grenade, the one with the long handle. Down in the bottom left, you see another harsh reality of this conflict, poison gas, mustard gas and chlorine gas especially. These just had terrible effects. The poison gases used in this conflict did lead to the creation of things like gas masks. It did get Kleenex tissues in business, because originally those were used as filters. They just blow your nose with them. But nonetheless, things like mustard gas would cause severe blistering of the skin. You breathe it in, it's going to blister your lungs. Chlorine gas, you breathe that in, it kind of breaks down the central nervous system, basically melts out your insides. It is just not pretty. And these types of things will be introduced by the Germans, but used by both sides as well. And here's the reality, the trenches. So basically, as these guys advanced, they realized that they couldn't keep advancing. So you don't want to lose the territory you have. So what do? You dig. And we see a huge series of trenches all across this western front. And the trench you're looking at here, this graphic depiction, there in the bottom left, you can see like down in the trench. That's a pretty fancy trench, right? I mean, some of these trenches are just ditches, right? You're just holding your head down, trying not to get killed. But others are pretty elaborate. You have some trenches, with officers' quarters, like dug down, beneath, the ground within the trench, right? You have a little step up there where you can step up and look over, but you have to be careful because you could get your head, mowed down by a machine gun looking over the top there. They actually have trench binoculars at this time. They actually created these binoculars so they could actually look up over the trench to try to see the enemy trench. Some of these trenches are, so close that soldiers can like yell obscenities at each other and throw things at each other. Others are miles apart, right? Some of them are so close that there are initiatives to try to dig under no man's land and try to break through to the other trench, digging underneath the ground. And the trenches themselves are just disgusting. They fill with water and bacteria and nastiness over the course of time. And of course, it's not like soldiers can just get up and leave if you're too close to the other guy. So basically you're stuck. And within these trenches, I mean, men just lose their minds. Trench foot, which basically rots the flesh on your feet, but also just the psychological turmoil of this conflict. Men, stuck next to soldiers with no head on their body for days at a time, hearing mortar shells exploding, never knowing, if you're going to live or die. It just plays tricks with the mind and leads people to madness. After this conflict, there'll be something called shell shock, which was what they said about soldiers who would do things like uncontrollably shake. Perfectly healthy 22-year-old young man who just couldn't stop shaking because of shell shock. Today we would call it PTSD. Other soldiers who, at the sight of a captain's hat, would just begin cowering and shivering in fear because they, see that officer's hat as someone who's going to tell them to charge up over the top and charge the enemy, right? So the reality of this conflict, just absolutely terrible, and these trenches, just awful. And here you see into some of these trenches, the one on the left, a little bit more complex, and you can see the men lying there just sleeping. This is how you have to be. And then the guys there on the right in this nasty trench, that's probably more the reality. And that's actually at the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun was a massive French fortress that the Germans try to take. The Germans bring in these massive siege guns they call Big Bertha guns, so big they have to bring them in on railways and lay siege to Verdun. The French do end up, holding off the Germans, but it's at a huge cost of human life, tens of thousands killed in a single battle. And, to me, one of the most amazing lines from this conflict: whole regiments gambled away eternity for 10 yards of wasteland. And that's the reality. I mean, many of these guys, the last sound they're ever going to hear is machine gun. And just terrible what these guys had to go through in this conflict. The other thing to point out, too, is good old social Darwinism. Remember, the Europeans are supposedly the superior race, right? According to them. And basically, what they had been telling the peoples in continent of Africa or in Asian countries, whether it be China or Japan, wherever, was that the Europeans were helping them, they were civilizing them, that the Europeans were, or rather that these non-European people simply can't help themselves and they need the Europeans for guidance. Well, the reality is this: who is fighting the worst war in human history at this time? Well, it's the Europeans. And that's what this cartoon is getting at. You see the so-called inferior people, quote unquote, looking on, and they're looking at the needless butchery, referring to the Great War, right? And you see how these non-European peoples are depicted. And that's what the cartoon is trying to get at, is that, oh, well, these people are, savage. But no, let's be realistic here. Who are the savages? Well, the Europeans, who are massacring one another in the worst conflict in human history to that point. And this cartoon's kind of getting at the same thing from the Columbus Dispatch here. You see this guy in China reading to another man here in China, and the guy seated asks, what are the Christians doing? And the guy reading the paper says, well, yesterday in Europe they killed 200,000 of each other, right? This is poking fun again at the Europeans, telling these other places, these so-called inferior peoples, that they needed to convert to Christianity because that was the correct faith for the Europeans, and it was peaceful and so on, which it is. But the reality is that the Europeans weren't exactly practicing what they preach, right? And kind of showing that the reality is that the Europeans have been rather hypocritical throughout all of this, and definitely not following Christ or Christianity. Well, this conflict is protracted. It's a big conflict over large swaths of territory. And speaking of protracted, we've come to the end of part one here of the Great War. So take a break, and we'll pick up with part two on, the next slide.